Juan and our National Zoo colleague, John Eisenberg, later performed an analysis of differences between carnivorous mammals, the largely solitary and apparently unsocial wild cats, and the largely social wild canids. They compared canids and felids in terms of their evolutionary histories, species and family distributions, habitat preferences, dog and cat morphology, and of course, differences in behavior. We looked at some of these differences in an earlier lecture. Felids are obligatory carnivores, and canids have omnivorous habits. Dogs and cats hear in the same frequency ranges, but have different visual and olfactory senses. Wild cats have the largest eyes of any carnivore, so may have better visual acuity at close range, while dogs have a wider field of vision. Dogs can smell at least 4 times better than cats based on the numbers of olfactory receptors. While cats use their olfactory abilities to find one another and examine other environmental scents up close, wolves and other wild dogs use their keen sense of smell to avoid predators and find prey from a greater distance. Kleiman and Eisenberg suggested that the type of stalking hunting that is performed by mostly solitary cats with the sharp, retractile felid claws are winning traits for the solitary felids. An increase in body size occurred in tigers, leopards, lions, and other cats as an adaptation to hunting large prey like deer, antelope, and other herbivores in a solitary way. In a separate niche in which many canids hunted slightly larger prey, the wild dogs kept a relatively moderate body size, and several species evolved well-developed pack hunting techniques. Because of these adaptations, Kleiman and Eisenberg suggested that group structure in canids is based on long-term affiliations between a mated adult pair and their offspring, while felid group structure is based on the core group of a mother and her maturing daughters. Canids therefore develop a strong pair bond not observed in the felids due to their ecological niche and evolutionary history. And canids have even evolved the behavior wherein males provision their young. We often think of exotic, faraway places when we think about animal studies. But did you know that Charles Darwin studied barnacles and earthworms most of his life because he found them to be incredibly interesting for answering the questions he had about natural selection and the beneficial nature of these creatures? Knowing this history of Darwin's natural history studies, it will not be surprising to you that research biologists at Smithsonian's National Zoo use the common song sparrow to study its diversity of size, color, and song. And they found out that song sparrows in different regions have regional dialects across subpopulations and subspecies. Smithsonian's animal behavior scientists and their colleagues have studied the songs of song sparrows to understand many behavioral questions, including whether or not individual sparrows recognize neighbors. They do. They have studied how sparrows communicate aggressive intent, and apparently singing very softly is a good indicator of this intent. Nothing like gentle singing before an attack. And they have studied how nutrition early in the life of sparrows influences song learning and complexity. They found that a better diet results in better songs. Although female song sparrows do not sing much, they do need to communicate, and much of sparrow communication happens through vocalizations. It turns out that female sparrows have vocalizations that are rarely heard from males, and these vocalizations are mainly heard during territorial disputes between females. Instinct is an adaptive behavior that can be performed without any learning. And there was a question in some biologists' minds about whether or not birdsong was instinctive or learned. When Immanuel Kant was writing about early educational theories, he commented on how house sparrows actually needed to learn their song, and how they could learn canary song if left with canary foster parents, which would appear to be a case of social learning. It was known for decades in the bird hobbyist literature that song sparrows were good early learners. Building off these concepts with common sparrows, some zoologists studied another North American sparrow, the white-crowned sparrow. Zoologists in California kept naive 50-day-old white-crowned sparrows in experimental cages with 2 compartments during which they could see and interact with a single adult that the scientists labeled a social tutor. Each experimental bird was tutored by an adult singing the song of their own subspecies of white-crowned sparrow, by an adult of another subspecies of white-crowned sparrow, or by an adult of a totally different species, the strawberry finch. Each of these bird species has a unique song. The scientists discovered that each of the experimental birds learned the song of his social tutor. Perhaps surprisingly, sparrows learn the song of the strawberry finch even when the sparrow's specific song was played as background noise during the tutoring process. These studies of a common bird are important because both species of sparrow occur across a range of diverse habitats. So scientists can examine how different environmental and selective pressures influence the diversity of biological and behavioral traits within a single species. Behavioral studies like these in a common species with a wide range provide a model for understanding how and why animal behavior evolves and is different across space and time. Virtually everything we do at zoos and wildlife management programs rests on an understanding of animal behavior. The data we get from these studies helps us improve the zoo environments of the animals we foster, helps us make the animals reproductively successful, and helps us prepare animals for successful reintroduction into the wild. As we get better at studying animal behavior and how it evolved, we become better caretakers for animals in zoos and in the wild. Have you ever wondered if animals can think like we think? Have you ever looked at your pet or an animal you saw in a zoo or an aquarium, like an orangutan, an elephant, a parrot, or an octopus, and wondered, what is that animal thinking? Or wondered if they think at all? We humans have been trying to figure out animal behavior for thousands of years. From over 30,000 until about 14,000 years ago, humans drew animals on the walls of European caves. Around 12,000 years ago, humans began domesticating goats and sheep in Mesopotamia. Some 2,200 years ago, Hannibal brought about 40 elephants and tens of thousands of men from Africa to Europe, crossed the Pyrenees and the Italian Alps, and won battles in Republican Rome. To accomplish any of these endeavors, it took some level of understanding of animal behavior. The more we learned about animal behavior, the more we began wondering if animals could be as smart or clever as us. Can animals make tools? Can they recognize their own reflections? Can they solve complex problems? Do they make complex and flexible decisions? Can animals think? First, let's ask, what is thinking? Is all information processing thinking? Probably not. The brain's job is to process information, to help convert nerve impulses to muscle action, right? Often this is true. If we touch a hot stove, we immediately draw our hand back before the nerve signal even makes it to the brain. That's what we call a reflex. When a bee sees a flower, that signal does make it all the way to the bee's tiny brain, and it causes the bee to fly toward that target. That's what we call an instinct. An instinctive behavior has three components. One, it is innate behavior, not learned. Two, it is a response to an environmental cue or stimulus. And three, it is a recognizable pattern of behavior. Think about those two examples I just mentioned. A human recoiling from pain is a reflex, a simple motion that doesn't require brain input. A bee responding to the presence of a flower requires multiple body systems, eyesight, flight, balance, and so on, to complete. This stimulus response model of the brain applies to even the simplest of creatures. But the more complex the animal's brain becomes, the more complex the animal's behavior becomes. In short, they begin to show signs of having a mind. The mind is different from the brain. It's the place where memory is processed and we can see the consequences of our actions. It's also where our emotions come from. It's the thing that helps us think. And we know that humans have a mind. Most animals have brains, which leads us to ask whether they can think. Do they have a sense of who they are? Do they have a mind? The answer lies in a simple definition. Thinking is mental flexibility, the ability to create a plan B if plan A doesn't work. If an animal reacts to a stimulus not with a pre-programmed, unchanging set of behaviors, but instead can figure out a fundamentally different way to reach its goal, then we can say that animal is thinking. So in this lecture, let's look at the behavior of a bunch of different animals and ask ourselves whether they can be said to think. We'll start with something that all of you are familiar with, the way that you, as a human being, become flexible. Think about some time that you acquired a new way of dealing with a problem. Maybe it was dealing with software on your computer, or maybe it was a cooking technique, or the best driving route between point A and point B. Whatever it was, you probably acquired that flexibility through one of two methods. Either you discovered it yourself through repeated trial and error, or someone showed you a new way. Let's explore trial and error learning first. Trial and error is a relatively simple kind of learning that we not only perform ourselves, but can observe in animals. Trial and error simply requires repeated, different attempts at a task over a certain amount of time. You or the animal then associate behaviors with the consequences they produce. Pleasant consequences tend to reinforce and increase behaviors. If a dog is cued to sit, does as he's asked, and receives a biscuit, that is a pleasant consequence for the dog performing the correct behavior. The dog will have a tendency to increasingly do the behavior that he expects will result in a reward. Animals also learn by trial and error in nature without human interference. For example, I've watched young ospreys hunting fish and missing, even though fish hunting may be a partially innate behavior in these birds. A young osprey may dive during multiple early attempts to catch a fish and probably misses several fish. Finally, the osprey dives at just the right speed and catches a fish, which is a pleasant consequence of a well-timed dive. Then, plunging into the ocean after fish in the most accurate and successful way is a learned behavior that tends to continue. Adult ospreys are amazing fish hunters. When we're in the lab looking at animal learning, a very common skill researchers utilize is maze navigation. In fact, rats have been tested in mazes for more than 100 years. Researchers use capital T-shaped mazes, understandably called T-mazes, with no food reward to determine whether rats have a right or left-handed turn preference. Once preference has been established, food rewards are added to see if the rats can change their preferences and how quickly that happens. More complex, timed mazes determine how fast the rats learn by trial and error. In these mazes, the pleasant consequence of a food reward is placed in some arm of the maze to see how many trials it takes for the rat to choose the food end of the maze consistently. And what if we move the rat's cheese? We can see how long it takes the rat to change his preference to the new food location, a measure of mental flexibility. Some rats are slower and some faster, but the conclusion is that a rat's behavior is not entirely instinctive. Rats can learn by trial and error. And through more and more sophisticated versions of this simple experiment, it has been shown that mice can use internal cues, like the scent of food, as well as external cues, like landmarks, to increase their probabilities of finding food in mazes over time. This is called spatial learning, the acquisition and later use of knowledge about the spatial environment. Animals with higher cognitive abilities may learn by trial and error, and they may also learn from watching adult animals, and this is called social learning. We know, of course, that we primates learn socially, and you may have witnessed social learning in mammalian carnivores, maybe even in your own household. You might have seen a mother cat teach her kitten how to hunt, or a mother dog teach her puppy how to use the stairs. But believe it or not, zoologists have recorded instances of social learning among fish, reptiles, and birds too. If a bird builds its nest for the first time and the nest is the same as every other first-time builders, this may be an innate behavior. But if we see variance in the use of materials, in nest location and height among first-time builders, then nest building probably involves some learned behaviors. So which is it? What do we find in nature? It seems that among social birds, like zebra finches, a first-time builder will copy his choice of nest material from other mature birds, even if he's not related to those mature birds. That's the important part. His preferred materials vary not by family group, but by social group. So we can see pretty clearly that there's a social learning component to nest building, at least in some species. Let's now look at how these two modes of learning play out among specific animals and specific behaviors, starting with tool use. For a long time, we were taught that only humans use tools, that only humans manipulated objects specifically for the purpose of achieving a mechanical advantage. However, zoologists observing animals carefully over a long period of time have found many examples of tool use in the animal kingdom. Back in the 1870s, Darwin specifically mentions baboon tool use in his book, The Descent of Man. But it was probably animal behavior pioneer Jane Goodall's studies of chimps in the late 1960s that really brought serious scientific attention to the subject of animal tool use. The first instance of tool use that Dr. Goodall observed is the behavior called ant dipping. She noticed a chimpanzee pushing a long stalk of grass into a hole in the ground, then pulling it out covered with termites. The chimpanzee followed this behavior by sticking the grass in his mouth and pulling the grass through his lips, the way you or I might get the last of a popsicle off a popsicle stick. Later, she saw chimps selecting twigs and stripping the leaves off of them specifically for use as ant dipping sticks. What this means is the chimps were deliberately creating tools, not just grabbing some object that was handy at the time. Later, the great ethologist Frans de Waal observed bonobos using leaves for cupping water, among other simple tools. Then, ethologist Christoph Bosch recorded instances of chimpanzees using tools. What's more, mother chimpanzees will show their offspring how to use stone tools to break hard-to-reach foods such as nuts. So we know we have social learning going on in chimps, which shouldn't surprise us too much since they are our fellow primates. And the open question was, how flexible was chimp tool use? Can they switch between left and right-handed use of ant dipping sticks? Do they make decisions about the plant species used to make their stick? Do they make decisions about the particular type of stick for a particular circumstance? some sticks being flexible and some being rigid, and so on. So researchers looked at geographically separate groups of chimpanzees, one in Tai National Park in the Ivory Coast, and others in Mahale National Park and near the Gombe Stream in Tanzania. Note that these groups have the entire continent of Africa in between them, so there is no chance of crossbreeding or social contact in the wild. However, these territories have similar environmental features, the same types of climate and food sources, and so on. And in fact, what scientists found was that the different populations use their tools differently. For example, the Gombe chimps use their hands to pull ants off the dipping stick and transfer them into their mouths. The Gombe chimps were more likely to use tools to retrieve ants, whereas it was mostly the female Tai chimps using tools, with the males just using their fingers. And Tai chimps preferred to make more modifications to their tools than the Gombe chimps. So there were differences in frequency of tool use and in modifications, and tool use is frequent with common, easily modified materials. There were a number of other differences in tool use, but the point is, researchers like ethologist Andy Whiten concluded that chimps not only had learning, they had culture. Different approaches to problem solving among different geographic groups, differences that couldn't be explained by genetics or environment. Because chimpanzees are our closest living relatives, sharing over 98% of our DNA, this raises an interesting question about early humans. We and other primates are evolutionarily related cousins. We're not descended from chimps. We and the chimps had a common ancestor, a great times a million grandparent. Knowing this, we can ask, did the common ancestor of chimps and humans evolve to use tools, or did both species evolve this skill independently? Is tool use itself the behavior that is innate, and using them efficiently is a learned behavior? When we're trying to understand our human past, the behavior of our closest living relatives raises intriguing possibilities. But it's not just our closest relatives that use tools. Sea otters dive deep into kelp gardens and gather rocks. Then, while floating on their backs, they place the rocks on their chests and use the rocks to break abalone mollusks. Scientists at Monterey Bay Aquarium have studied this behavior and confirmed that young otters must be taught this shell-breaking behavior by their mothers, or, if hand-raised, by their keepers. Animal behavior researchers agree that this is a clear example of tool use, not only because the rocks fit the definitions of tools, but because otters will keep their favorite rocks, storing them in a pouch of flesh under their armpits. As an interesting side note, most otters store their rocks in their left armpit, so I guess this means most otters are right-handed. I think we can agree, though, that there's a lot more to intelligence than using tools. For example, how many times have you looked into a mirror to brush your teeth or comb your hair, to inspect parts of your mouth or face you normally cannot see? We humans use mirrors because we are aware of ourselves. That's why we call this phenomenon mirror self-recognition, or MSR. Have you ever wondered about the mental abilities necessary for MSR? Human children do not use a mirror as adults do until they're about 18 to 24 months old, just around the age they can pass tests about the thoughts and feelings of others, tests that, together, show children are self-aware and possess empathy. When dogs see themselves in a mirror, they treat the image as if it's another dog. They might growl at the mirror image of this new dog, or go around to the back of the mirror to find the other dog, or even just look at the mirror without any reaction because the dog in the mirror provides no feedback. Dogs may use the mirror to help them examine their surroundings. My chocolate lab, Amanda, often used the mirror to watch me in the background, but she didn't stand in front of the mirror examining parts of herself. Monkeys do the same thing as dogs when presented with a mirror. Despite repeated testing, they have not recognized themselves in a mirror. Because of this, MSR was once thought to be another uniquely human quality. So what about our closest relatives, the great apes? Shouldn't our closest relatives be able to recognize themselves in a mirror just as they can use tools like we can? Back in the 1970s, psychologist Gordon Gallup tested this by giving chimps a full-length mirror. The chimps grimaced menacingly at their image at first, just as your dog might growl at its reflection. But after a while, the chimps moved back and forth in front of the mirror to see what the mirror image would do. This phase of understanding a mirror is called contingency testing. When Gallup's chimps finally recognized their image in the mirror as themselves, they began checking their mouths and teeth, their nostrils. In subsequent studies, they even checked their rumps. These are parts of their body they could not normally see. They would even blow bubbles at themselves. To confirm that this was true MSR, Gallup developed the mark test. Marks of ink were placed on the foreheads of anesthetized chimps to see if chimps would use the mirror to examine and touch the mark when they woke. They did. Then, some moved the hand that touched the ink to their nose or mouth to inspect the mark chemical, so they clearly recognized their own face and hand in the mirror. The fact that chimps could show MSR was more evidence that animal and human self-awareness is on a continuum. It makes us wonder about other animals and their abilities for self-recognition. Take dolphins, for instance. Dolphins are social, big-brained animals, just like chimps. But do they show MSR? My friend Diana Reese, a cognitive psychologist at Hunter College of the City University of New York, and her colleague Lori Marino showed mirrors to dolphins at the New York Aquarium to see what they would do. The dolphins performed many self-directed and unusual behaviors in front of the mirror, including blowing bubbles and doing cartwheels, suggesting that they were aware that the dolphins in the mirror were images of themselves. But they also used the classic mark test to test this further. They marked 2 male dolphins with a dolphin-safe temporary mark on different locations on their bodies in many sessions. The dolphins swam immediately to the mirror and oriented the marked area to the mirror, clear evidence that dolphins have MSR. And then there are Asian elephants, another big-brained social animal. Asian elephants are known to break off leafy branches and swat at pesky biting flies. This is certainly another example of using a tool, right? And we will find that Asian elephants demonstrate intelligence in other ways. A friend of mine named Josh Plotnick decided he wanted to study animal behavior and cognition for his graduate work. Josh, his graduate advisor Franz Duvall, and Diana Reese decided to study MSR in elephants using the elephants Happy, Maxine, and Patty at the Bronx Zoo. With the assistance of the Bronx Zoo's curators, they built an 8-foot by 8-foot steel-framed, indestructible mirror to be placed in an elephant exercise yard. The elephants each approached the mirror individually. Happy moved in and out of mirror range and seemed especially interested in where her ear was in relation to the mirror. Interestingly, Josh and Diana never observed aggressive behavior like researchers have seen in chimps, but the elephants did try to smell or see what was on the other side of the mirror. They decided to do the mark test by placing a visible X on the elephant's forehead dome. It's visible in a mirror, and it's an area of the body that elephants naturally touch but cannot normally see. Asian elephants have 2 prominent forehead domes, so it would be easy to place both a visible and an invisible mark on each elephant. But since elephants have a trunk that is a highly sensitive extension of their nose, it proved especially important to design a mark test with an invisible sham mark that would have the same scent as the visible mark. The elephants might be touching the marks while using their sense of smell rather than their sense of sight during the experiment. Once they had the mark and sham mark with the same or a similar scent, Happy was marked with the white mark and the clear sham mark.
She walked to the mirror and examined her visible mark, not the sham mark or any other place on her body.
The Bronx Zoo's Happy was thus the first elephant to show human scientists that elephants also have the capacity for MSR. So we have evidence of both tool use and self-recognition among larger-brained animals. But is that all there is to intelligence? Is all behavior that seems clever really clever? In the early 20th century, throngs of amazed people turned out in Europe to see a German trotting horse named Clever Hans, who seemed to be able to count. He could correctly answer math questions asked by his owner, or even by someone else. The German Board of Education was skeptical about Hans's intelligence, so they appointed the Hans Commission to evaluate his behavior. This large commission of animal scientists and educators determined after close observation that no tricks were involved in these demonstrations, that there was no fraud. Then, another scientist was asked to probe Clever Hans's behavior more deeply. The scientists created a variety of trials. In one, Hans was isolated from observers, so no cues could come from them. In another, different questions were posed. In yet another, the questioners themselves were varied and occasionally didn't know the answer themselves. Through these variables, the careful scientists determined that Hans was not actually doing math, but reading people's behavior. If someone knew the answer to the questions asked, they had a different body posture or their facial expression would change as Hans got close to the correct answer. If Hans could not see these cues from humans, he was only right about 5% of the time. Hans could probably read cues because horses need to read one another's body postures and facial expressions in nature. Another possibility is that Hans could read cues because through the domestication process, domesticated animals have become very good at reading human-provided social cues. It turns out that subtle cues may be given by any human researcher, even when they're trying to be neutral in their behavior. This is a phenomenon now known as the Clever Hans effect. So, studies of Clever Hans caused the more careful observation methods we have in modern animal behavior studies. This helps us prevent any inadvertent cueing of test subjects and helps us better control experiments. So I guess Hans wasn't clever, or was he? Was his behavior a byproduct of the domestication process? If a horse is watching a different species, we humans, and is able to accurately react to a cue, is that some level of clever? What do you think? Could you read a dog, a cat, or a horse? Why do you think that is so? I actually do think Hans was clever. Let's consider one of our nearest relatives again. How clever are orangutans? Orangutans rely on memory every day, whether recognizing friends or when they're foraging for food. At the National Zoo, orangutans have a choice of where to spend their time, either in the Great Ape House or hundreds of feet away in the think tank exhibit. In these exhibits, orangutans can choose to participate in touchscreen memory games with the zoo's cognitive researchers. Since 1994, these researchers have used hypothesis testing science to study thinking, learning, communication, and decision-making. How do orangutans solve problems that are presented by scientists during these studies? We discovered that, like chimps, Smithsonian's orangutans use tools, pieces of bamboo that they manipulate as extensions of their arms, to reach fruit that's left out of their reach. But they go way beyond that. Orangutans can also remember lists of items we present to them via computer screens and seem to recall these lists the way human children do. If you visit the National Zoo, you can test yourself in similar computer games. I bet that the orangutans will beat you on the randomized memory test every time. What about even higher order thinking? Have you ever tried putting a puzzle together? The difference between trial and error problem solving and insightful problem solving lies in the mind. As with a puzzle, we can try to place puzzle pieces through trial and error, or we can think about where the pieces go and develop a solution in our mind's eye. That's called insightful problem solving, or an aha moment. Surely a human level thinking ability.
A doctoral student working on his dissertation at the National Zoo, named Preston Forder, along with his mentor Diana Reese, wanted to study problem solving using tools in elephants. So we introduced them to Candela, a male elephant born at the National Zoo. Preston wanted to try a test that had been tried on chimpanzees over 100 years ago.
A scientist named Wolfgang Kohler saw that chimps could stack wooden crates to use as makeshift ladders to retrieve bananas that were placed out of reach. Kohler thought that the chimps had not arrived at these flexible solutions through trial and error, but had developed the answer in their mind's eye.
So Preston put food vertically out of Candela's trunk reach. Then he gave Candela both bamboo sticks and a large plastic cube, an elephant version of the crates Kohler had given to the chimps. When given this choice of tools, Candela moved the cube around to get the food with no problem. Candela had an aha moment. Remember, an elephant's dominant sense is the sense of smell. Candela had chosen the tools that left him able to get his trunk where the food was located. He could smell and grasp the food with his trunk. I actually witnessed a slightly different variation of this experiment. This time the cube was replaced with several butcher blocks.
I watched as Candela walked outside. He looked around. He looked at the food above him. He looked around at the yard again. We all watched in anticipation as he walked very deliberately from one butcher block to the next and carried each in turn to a point directly underneath the suspended fruit. When he had stacked enough butcher blocks, Candela stood on them just like they were a stool
and was almost able to reach the fruit with his trunk. Candela clearly now understood the best way to solve this problem.
Now, what if something that seems like complex thinking can be explained in a much simpler way? A study by Smithsonian and university scientists used high-tech tools to track decision-making by wild olive baboons at the Impala Research Center in Kenya. These baboons live in large groups of about 100 individuals. These usually consist of a large number of females who are genetically related and a smaller number of unrelated males who join the group at maturity in order to mate. Group life is very cohesive and very hierarchical. And when you hear of a hierarchical species, the tendency is to assume that there is a high-ranking individual, probably a male, either making decisions for the group or at least heavily influencing the behavior of that group. But is that really the case? To study this, researchers fitted one group's adult baboons with GPS radio collars that recorded individual baboon positions every second and gathered data on group movement patterns. It turned out that, rather than always following one or two leaders, baboons tended toward majority rules decision-making. For example, if just one baboon initiated movement, all the baboons eventually moved in that direction. But if two baboons initiated movement, one of two things could happen. If their directions were similar, they would veer together and the whole group would choose that compromised direction. But if they chose opposite or near opposite directions, then one baboon would gradually accumulate more followers, and the second initiator and his followers would eventually follow the first. And interestingly, the dominant male of the group was no more or less likely to be the initiator or to gather more followers. Each baboon was making its own decision. The researchers concluded that some form of democratic collective action was governing baboon movement. The question for us is this: how deeply are the baboons thinking during their daily decision-making? Are there other factors we're not seeing? Whatever the case, this study shows us how careful we need to be when we are thinking about thinking. So with all this evidence in front of you, I'm going to ask you to draw your own conclusions. Are animals clever? Can animals think? Animal intelligence is studied using a combination of ethology, psychology, and neuroscience. Do you now think it is important to understand animal intelligence?